Everything that Jordan says he didn't do, he's doing. It's a bummer because it's there, and Peterson acts like it's not. This is why if you ever do a debate, friends, just download all the books and type Control F and enter the word nature. It's pretty easy. I did that for this. I went to Capitol after I saw that lecture and I Control F'd nature, and it took the application on my computer about 5 minutes to get all of the references to nature in the book because there's so many of them. What's up, guys? So last month I did a video looking at Jordan Peterson's take on postmodern philosophy, and lots of you watched it and we really appreciated all the comments and feedback. But making the video was hard, not just because I had to watch hours and hours of Jordan Peterson lectures, but because I had prepped so much that by the time we started filming, I realized I had severely overdone it. What ended up in the final video is about 50% of what I prepped, maybe even less. In fact, the video was originally supposed to be about Peterson's takes on postmodernism and Marxism, but the later stuff was cut altogether. But after asking the chat community on Wisecrack Live, our weekly stream, which you should check out, if I should finish the Peterson project, I'm here to cover some of the material we left out. Particularly, we're going to look at what happens when Jordan Peterson tries his hand at reading Karl Marx. Let's get into it. Okay, so to set a little bit of context, the video I'm going to use is from a debate that took place between Peterson and philosopher Slavoj Žižek. Now, the debate was meant to be about the question of communism versus capitalism, and as part of his presentation, Peterson tried to debunk Marx and communism via a reading that is solely based on the co-authored political pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto. If you're not familiar with the text, it's a short work that was co-written with Friedrich Engels. Now, the aim of it was to be an accessible and concise text that could be read by workers around the world to aid in their understanding of the exploitation of the working class under capitalism and the necessity for a new political system. The manifesto outlines the antagonisms between two classes, the bourgeoisie, those who own the means of production and have access to capital, and the proletariat, the working class, who need to exchange their labor to acquire the means of subsistence. Okay, all that said, let's get into the debate, and we're going to pick up with Peterson introducing his argument.
I have to tell you, and I'm not trying to be flippant here, that I have rarely read a tract. Now, I read it when I was 18. It was a long time ago, right? That's 40 years ago. But I've rarely read a tract that made as many errors per sentence, conceptual errors per sentence, as the Communist Manifesto. It was quite a miraculous reread.
Okay, so Jordan Peterson doesn't like the Communist Manifesto. He came in pretty spicy. But my initial issue with this is it seems really weird to reference the Communist Manifesto as the sole text that represents Marxism and communism as a whole for the purpose of this debate. It's a text he co-wrote with Engels that doesn't really get at the whole of his economic and philosophical theories. So, there's two ways we can interpret this. One, and it's the good faith reading, is that this was an earnest attempt by Jordan Peterson to do his homework and debate the intellectual merits of communism and Marxism on their own terms because he thought that this text was a good example of Marx's economic and philosophic theories. Or there's a more cynical reading, which is that Jordan Peterson is well aware as an academic that Marx's mature economic thought is located in other books like The German Ideology and Capital, and that in making the choice to avoid those texts, he can instead focus on a pamphlet that was written with Engels and doesn't really contain the fullness of Marx's intellectual arguments. And that's just something that kind of irks me throughout watching this debate, that I would like to see Jordan Peterson really respond to the fullness of Marx's ideas, and he doesn't. And because of that, you could say that a specter is haunting this debate. The specter of Jordan Peterson not doing his homework.
What struck me about the Communist Manifesto was it was akin to something Jung said about typical thinking, and this was the thinking of people who weren't trained to think. He said that the typical thinker has a thought, it appears to them like an object might appear in a room. The thought appears, and then they just accept it as true. They don't go the second step, which is to think about the thinking. And that's the real essence of critical thinking.
Okay, so I find this really interesting because Peterson is implying that Marx, and in this case Engels, did not take their whole arsenal to the critique they're offering in this text. And this is a point where it seems like Peterson and Karl have a lot more in common than they realize. You could argue that Marx, in most of his work, is doing precisely what Peterson's talking about, right? Marx is analyzing the logic of industrial capitalism, which is assumed, or was assumed at the time, to be a good and logical system, and he's looking for internal contradictions and antagonisms within that system. When Peterson says that you need to use everything in your arsenal to see if an idea can survive, it seems like he's describing what Marx is doing, and Marx called this ruthless criticism. Or in one text, the ruthless criticism of everything existing. Now here's Marx, and this is from a letter he wrote in 1843. Marx says, "Now philosophy has become mundane, and the most striking proof of this is that philosophical consciousness itself has been drawn into the torment of the struggle, not only externally but also internally. But if constructing the future and settling everything for all times are not our affair, it is all the more clear what we have to accomplish at present. I am referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just as little afraid of conflict with the powers that be." I don't know, I just find that interesting that Peterson is describing something similar to what Marx is doing, and one could argue that Marx is doing that in the text at hand.
That's what you try to teach people in university, is to read a text and to think about it critically, not to destroy the utility of the text, but to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so what I tried to do when I was reading the Communist Manifesto was to separate the wheat from the chaff. And I'm afraid I found some wheat, yes, but mostly chaff. And I'm going to explain why, hopefully in relatively short order.
So I find this interesting because when he says, people, and it seems to be implied here that Marx doesn't go a second step to think about thinking. Well, like Marx came up studying and eventually critiquing the philosophical work of Hegel, a 19th century German idealist. Now, Hegel and the German idealist tradition was focused on precisely this, right? Thinking about thinking, or maybe put differently, thinking about the possibility of the conditions of thinking. Idealist philosophy could be summed up as maybe the most detailed thinking about thinking in the history of philosophy. And Marx was well aware of this tradition. He studied it. It was included in his PhD dissertation. He wrote a book on Hegel. And Marx then turns this logical system on its head by taking the method that the idealists used to think about thinking and using it to think about history and materiality and politics. It's said that Marx, turns Hegel on his head by making that mode of thinking about reality and not ideas. And I don't know, I just think it's unfortunate that Peterson doesn't seem to be aware of that.
Here's proposition number one. History is to be viewed primarily as an economic class struggle. All right, so let's think about that for a minute. First of all, the proposition there is that history is primarily to be viewed through an economic lens, and I think that's a debatable proposition because there are many other motivations that drive human beings than economics, and those have to be taken into account.
Okay, so Peterson's critical of the idea that he's reading the Communist Manifesto as making the claim that for Marx, history is primarily viewed as an economic and class struggle. And there's definitely truth to that. What Marx is doing is reading history dialectically. Now here's what Marx says himself in the manifesto, or Marx and Engels say themselves. "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." But on the word society, there's actually a footnote in the text. And in the footnote, they say that is all written history. So, the full line is the history of all written society is the history of class struggle. So, Marx is specifying that he's talking about written history, largely European history. They also go on to say this in the manifesto. "In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations." So in that quote, we see that Marx and Engels, while reading history as the history of class struggle and antagonism, are not always just breaking it down to binary oppositions. They seem to understand the complexity of those relations.
you've got to understand that this is a deeper problem for people on the left, not just for people on the right. It is the case that hierarchical structures dispossess those people who are at the bottom, those creatures who are at the bottom, speaking, say, of animals, but those people who are at the bottom, and that is a fundamental existential problem. But the other thing that Marx didn't seem to take into account is that there are far more reasons that human beings struggle than their economic class struggle, even if you build the hierarchical idea into that.
Okay, so here Peterson is criticizing the manifesto for presumably saying that all human history is the history of struggle, and that struggle and class struggle is inherently tied to capitalism. Now, Peterson is noting that struggle and human hierarchy, of course, pre-exists capitalism. And he's totally right. And I don't think that Marx would disagree with him at all. Now, Marx has a dialectical reading of history in which history is marked by struggle and antagonism, but it's not that capitalism is the driving force of that. It's that capitalism, when he is writing, is the most advanced stage of that historical development. Let's see what Marx has to say himself. This is from the German Ideology, and Marx says, "The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus, the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. Man can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. They themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life." So here, Marx is grounding human struggle in the particularity of humans producing their own means of subsistence. So before capitalism or any other economic system, there is this fundamental relationship between humans and nature. And this relationship and the struggle implicit in it is the foundation of human consciousness and society. And Marx never implies that this struggle doesn't pre-exist capitalism.
There are far more reasons that human beings struggle than their economic class struggle, even if you build the hierarchical idea into that, which is a more comprehensive way of thinking about it. Human beings struggle with themselves, with the malevolence that's inside themselves, with the evil that they're capable of doing, with the spiritual and psychological warfare that goes on within them. And we're also actually always at odds with nature. And this never seems to show up in Marx, and it doesn't show up in Marxism in general. It's as if nature doesn't exist. The primary conflict, as far as I'm concerned, or a primary conflict that human beings engage in, is the struggle for life in a cruel and harsh natural world.
Okay, this is officially becoming a tough hang, because right here, Peterson is accusing Marx of not thinking about or acknowledging nature, or not even acknowledging the existence of nature. He's accusing Marx of not acknowledging that a primary struggle for humanity is the struggle with nature. But Marx does that. So I'm going to let Marx talk for a second. Here's Marx from the Paris manuscripts. "Nature is man's inorganic body. That is to say, nature insofar as it is not the human body. Man lives from nature, and he must maintain a continuing dialogue with it if he is not to die. To say that man's physical and mental life is linked to nature simply means that nature is linked to itself, for man is a part of nature." So right here, he's noting that contradiction between man and nature is fundamental to human existence. And this is Marx describing the fundamental antagonisms that drive human consciousness and history. Everything Peterson says he doesn't do, he's doing. Let's let Marx talk some more. This is Marx from Capital Volume 1. He says, "Labor is, in the first place, a process in which both man and nature participate, and in which man of his own accord starts, regulates, and controls the material reactions between himself and nature. He opposes himself to nature as one of her own forces, setting in motion arms and legs, heads and hands, the natural forces of his body, in order to appropriate nature's productions in a form adapted to his own wants. By thus acting on the external world and changing it, he at the same time changes his own nature." So again, this is Marx describing the interaction between humans and nature as fundamental to the process of labor, fundamental to history, and fundamental to developing our own humanity. So everything that Jordan says he didn't do, he's doing. It's a bummer because it's there. And Peterson acts like it's not.
Binary class struggle idea, that was a bad idea. That was a very, very bad idea. It's also bad in this way, and this is a real sleight of hand that Marx pulls off, is you have a binary class division, proletariat and bourgeoisie, and you have an implicit idea that all of the good is on the side of the proletariat and all of the evil is on the side of the bourgeoisie. And that's classic group identity thinking.
I want to talk more about what he says about good and evil, or good and bad. We'll get to that in a second. It's important to note that what Marx is doing in the Manifesto and other places is analyzing economic struggles specific to 19th century industrial capitalism. And this claim that there's something akin to identity politics just doesn't make a lot of sense, because Marx is not talking about individual human identity or even group identity. He's talking about the way that humans relate to themselves and labor under industrial capitalism. Here is a quote from Marx. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. So just to be clear, Marx is saying that we live under circumstances not of our own making, and we think and develop in response to those historical conditions. So again, he's not saying the world should be this way. He's saying the world is this way. It's an analytic claim. Let's keep going because I want to talk a little bit more about this weird moral argument he gets into.
It's one of the reasons I don't like identity politics, is because once you divide people into groups and pit them against one another, it's very easy to assume that all the evil in the world can be attributed to one group, the hypothetical oppressors, and all the good to the other. And that, well, and that's naive. That's naive beyond comprehension, because it's absolutely foolish to make the presumption that you can identify someone's moral worth with their economic standing.
Okay, so Peterson is making the claim that there's an implicit and a priori argument in Marx that good is on the side of the workers and bad is on the side of the owners, and that's just simply not true. A priori arguments are arguments that come before experience or observation, and that's the opposite of what Marx is doing. Marx is doing an objective analysis of the economic conditions that he sees under industrial capitalism. He's not doing a subjective analysis of the morality of individuals. He's trying to describe the world as it is, not evaluating its moral standing. And you simply don't see these types of discussions taking place in Marx's actual text, definitely not in the Manifesto. So by trying to read an economic analysis as if it's a moral philosophy, Peterson just gets himself all confused. And it's also worth noting that for Marx, it's not people or groups of people who are bad or good, it is systems and structures. And by abolishing alienating systems, it disalienates everyone, both workers and owners. So important to note that.
The fact that you assume a priori that all the evil can be attributed to the capitalists and all the good, the bourgeoisie, and all the good could be attributed to the proletariat meant that you could hypothesize that a dictatorship of the proletariat could come about. And that was the first stage in the communist revolution. And remember, this is a call for revolution, and not just revolution, but bloody, violent revolution, and the overthrowing of all existent social structures.
Okay, friends, this simply isn't true what he's saying here, and I think it's kind of dangerous when he makes this claim. In his entire career, Karl Marx was fairly consistent about not advocating for revolutionary violence. Now, to be clear, Marx didn't make that argument on moral grounds. He thought that violence could be strategically problematic. Now, to give the final word here to Marx and Engels, here's how they describe revolution in the Communist Manifesto. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. And all these movements they bring to the front as the leading question in each the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. Finally, they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. And I think that last line is really important. They labor everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. And that's something you see in the manifesto, their call for communists to work with democratic parties and parties in all countries that support their aims. It is not a text that calls for violent revolution. I know this because I opened up my PDF of it. I typed Control F. I typed in the word violence. I clicked return and nothing came up. So in case you thought I didn't do my research, I did. Okay, and we're gonna have to call it there. You can watch this full debate if you want to. It's on YouTube, but that's all I have time for today. Okay, so we did it again, and our journey, at least for now, is complete. And much like the first video that we did on Peterson, I don't know, I find it disappointing that someone with his very impressive academic background and pedigree didn't actually engage with the full scope of Marx's work. Now, whether or not one agrees or disagrees with Marx's critique of capitalism, it doesn't do anyone any favors to offer a critique of his work that doesn't engage with the actual ideas themselves. And like his critique of postmodern philosophers like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, it seems like, again, Peterson isn't actually critiquing Karl Marx, the writer and thinker, but instead critiquing a straw man version of what he perceives modern neo-Marxism to be. We see this when he brings up things like identity politics when supposedly discussing the Communist Manifesto, the text, which has nothing to say about identity politics. And it's worth noting that I am not saying any of this to just dunk on Peterson. I gain no pleasure, okay, maybe a little bit of pleasure, in pointing out his misreadings of Marx. But this is important because, again, Peterson has a massive intellectual influence, and especially because of his academic background and credentials, people take him seriously. But it's reckless to present ideas like this on such a public stage when he isn't, to use the parlance of our times, doing the work. And even if you, like Peterson, find Marx's intellectual work revolting, I hope you can at least hate him for the right reasons and not for the things Peterson made up. But please let us know what you think in the comments. Really appreciate you hanging out for another one of these. And again, check out the first video if you haven't. Thank you so much to all of our patrons for supporting our community. Check out our Patreon page if you haven't before. It truly is the best way that you can directly support our channel. And you get some fun perks. You get videos early with no ads, some extra content, and you get to join our Discord community where you can talk about Jordan Peterson and a number of other things. So again, thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you later.